I'm BNEWS Director Rich Hosford, and I'm happy and excited to welcome you to our new show, BNEWS In Depth. In this monthly show, we'll delve deep into one issue facing the town. The format may change from month to month, but the goal will be the same, to look at one topic and drill down as far as we can to bring you both sides. We're starting this week with the proposed ban on the sale of recreational marijuana in Burlington that will be before town meeting later this month in the form of 2 bylaw changes. We spoke to 2 people in favor of the ban and 2 against. We spoke to the pairs separately because we are more interested in having a discussion than a debate. We'll go to the proponents of the ban first. Here is that interview. Hello and welcome. And for this part of the show, we have my two guests here today are in favor of the ban. In fact, they were part of the Recreational Marijuana Advisory Committee. We have to my immediate right, Planning Board member Barbara LaRue, and to my far right, Board of Selectmen member Jimmy Tigas. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you, Rich.
So, can we just start off, just to give us the big picture of what's coming up in town meeting and how we got here. So we have two articles, zoning articles. One is zoning and one a general.
One is a general bylaw that's being put forward by the Board of Selectmen. The other one is a zoning bylaw which is being put forward by the Planning Board. The reason this committee was formed, though, was that after question 4 passed in November, we thought it was important to get together people from lots of different boards in town to talk about the issue and to determine what was the best way for Burlington to move forward when it came to recreational marijuana. So we formed this committee that included members from almost all of the boards in town and put everybody in the room and started talking it through. When that happened, it actually was pretty clear to us what we should do, mainly because of the vote that Burlington had in November 2016. And we felt pretty strongly that the voters of Burlington told us what they wanted, and that as elected members, we were obliged to follow their lead and come up with bylaws that the townspeople would want based on their vote.
Yeah, and in the election, just go over the numbers again.
Sure. Question 4, which was in November 2016, there were 6,303 votes in favor of recreational marijuana, which represents 44% of the people who voted. There were 7,662 votes against question 4. That's 54% of the voting population. And then there were some blanks that count for about 2%. But what's really interesting about that vote is that because it was a presidential election and a hotly contested race, we had a very high turnout. We had about 85% of all eligible voters turn out, which is remarkably high.
Sure, to put that in perspective, I think at this last town election, we had 5 to 6% of people voting in it. So.
And when we have more hotly contested town issues, we will sometimes get more, but we're lucky to get 15 to 20%. So an 85% turnout is really remarkable, and so we really felt it represented what Burlington wanted, the most representative vote that we could get. Because if we were to try to have another vote of just a town vote, we would not be able to get those kind of numbers. So this was a very large percentage of the eligible voters, and their decision was clear.
So let's talk about that. Well, first let's go back. What exactly would these warrant articles prohibit, and also on the flip side of that, what would they not prohibit?
Thank you. Yes. Well, both articles are almost identical, and what they do is they prohibit the retail sale of marijuana or marijuana products, and that would include
recreational marijuana.
Recreational marijuana products. Correct. This does not affect medical marijuana at all. It also does not affect an individual's right to possess marijuana, use marijuana, or even grow it in their own home for personal use. It only affects the retail sale of the product in town. So people are allowed to grow their own marijuana and can even gift it to their friends. They just can't sell it.
Right. Now, there was talk about also having a possibility of a ballot referendum,
Yes.
like you said, would probably get lower turnout than
Yes.
the original November vote. But people's minds do change as as issues evolve.
Yes.
But it's a possibility. Where's that? Is it required? Is it necessary? Where I know there's
That's
like
a
lot
really
of
good
action
question, Rich.
Depends on the day of the week, really.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of
Yes,
action at the state
right.
level, and they haven't really finished, dotting all their I's and crossing
That's
their
right.
T's. But what does it look like where we are?
The most recent information that we're getting from the state is that it depends on how your town voted. So the latest information we've received is that if your town voted in favor of recreational marijuana, the only way you as a town could ban it would be to have a referendum vote. But if your town voted against recreational marijuana, you don't have to do the referendum vote. You could handle it through what they call your legislative body, which in Burlington would be town meeting. It could also go to the Board of Selectmen, which is also our other legislative arm. And the Board of Selectmen could also institute a ban. So we actually are still in consultation with Town Council. We know that the zoning bylaw proposal and the general bylaw proposal, if passed, are the right thing to do. What we don't know is, do we need that third piece, either the Board of Selectmen voting, or we could still do a referendum vote if we chose, but it's not required.
What we're planning on doing is, we're planning for having it if we need it. If we don't need it, even better. But we don't want to lose the opportunity. Again, as Barbara stated, the residents spoke clearly back in November. The state may want this, but the Burlington residents said this is not what they want in their backyard. We want to honor that request, honor their sentiment, and do this on their behalf. That's why we're doing this. Burlington residents voted against this, clearly. So we don't want to miss any opportunity to protect their interest and their wishes. So if we're planning on a referendum, if it's needed, if we don't need one, fine. But we're going to make sure we, as Barbara stated, cross all our T's, dot all our I's, make sure everything's in place, and so that we can do what's right for the citizens based on their vote.
Now, I don't want to get too inside baseball, but it's my understanding, so there's a general bylaw change and then a zoning bylaw change up before. You said they're identical. Now, is it true that one of them, that the zoning bylaw change is going to need 2/3?
Yes, the verbiage of the two bylaws is very similar, but any zoning change requires a 2/3 majority of town meeting, whereas the general bylaw changes only require 51%.
So what happens if, the general passes what the zoning doesn't? Where does that put the town?
Very good question. I think it puts the town in a slightly more vulnerable position, but it's still relatively strong because the general bylaw is actually the more important of the two from what we're reading from the state. Because what the state is telling us now is that you cannot ban recreational marijuana with a zoning bylaw change alone, that you would also need the general bylaw change. But they don't say the reverse of that. So it's still all open for interpretation.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the lawyers will have a field day with this because it's relatively vague.
No matter what happens, the lawyers always make
Yes, that's true.
And Jimmy, or both of you, but there's, in the meetings of the advisory meetings and just talking to voters, residents, what are some of the, concerns that people have that you've heard as far as, having marijuana shops or marijuana bars in town?
Well, people that I've talked to, a lot of people, I haven't heard one person tell me they want this in their neighborhood. I've had numerous people tell me they don't want it in their neighborhood, if it gets allowed. So to me, the people are nervous, are worried about the possibility of a retail marijuana, recreational marijuana business being in their neighborhood. And there are all sorts of potential issues that could come up with a business like that. We have to remember it's a cash-only business, right? Because it's still illegal federally.
Federal, right, law.
So it's a cash-only business, and with cash-only businesses, there are certain risks, certain issues that arise with a cash-only business. There's potential for crime, and the other thing too is, other people have said to me that other towns are banning this. Other towns are doing this. If other towns start banning retail recreational marijuana, then Burlington would be one of the few that allow it. And that would cause other, problems such as additional traffic. We got to call, say it is what it is, potential for impaired driving.
Right, and is there any way of sort of judging? I mean, I guess there's like a field test, but there's no equivalent to a breathalyzer, correct?
No, you would need what's called a drug recognition expert, and there are very few of them. Burlington has one.
Okay, so he'd be busy.
Very busy.
All right. Some of the other concerns that I think I saw raised at one of the planning board meetings was by someone who owned a local business, and I think his thought was that what he was saying was it would just make the town have a different look to it if there was a bunch of pot shops or dispensaries or around town.
And that also would depend on how many there were. And so that's another question, because some towns may choose to restrict the number of marijuana stores to 1, 2, or 5. Burlington, or we as a committee, decided we wanted to go ahead with a full ban. That's a concern that one person mentioned. I haven't heard that consistently. One thing I have heard consistently is that there is increased concern among parents and among educators that the more available marijuana is, the greater the chances are of it falling into the hands of children, either teenagers who want it or young children who mistake it for something else, because marijuana edibles oftentimes are in the form of candy or cookies or brownies. There is the potential for accidental ingestion. So that has been a concern that some people have raised.
Now, let's say this doesn't pass. There was, if I'm not mistaken, with the medical, zoning changes made that at least would limit where they could set up shop. Is
That's
the same
correct.
in effect for recreational now, or would that be something that would come afterwards?
If these bylaws did not pass town meeting, and we then would be expecting to have recreational marijuana stores opening in town, we would have to pass another bylaw similar to the medical marijuana bylaw that would dictate where those facilities could locate. Because right now there is no definition for a recreational marijuana facility in our bylaw.
Right.
So we would need to define it and then decide where it could go. And we probably would follow a very similar course as we did with medical marijuana, I guess, but that's really just a guess on my part.
Right, and that was keeping it away from parks and schools and sort of sensitive areas.
Parks, schools, churches, and we disallowed it in a property that was adjacent to a residential property.
Right. Now, I mean, one of the things I think that people who would be in favor of it, besides maybe their own interest in having it close by, is that, it is a big business. It is, the law is written in such a way that the town can add its own tax on top of what the state's going to have. It's a revenue. We're always talking about our business community. So what would be your arguments against, going for the money with this?
Well, I'll speak on that part. What is being promoted as is a 20% tax, and technically it's up to a 20% tax, but what's not out there clearly is that it can only be up to a 3% local tax. The other 17% tax goes to the state. It's a sales tax. That'll go to the state. So the town can go up to, it can tack on an additional 3%, and that would be the potential for the town revenue. But as I stated earlier, it's a cash business. 3% of what? You have to hope that someone that's selling recreational retail marijuana is being 100% honest on their income or what they're taking in for their sales and paying 3% tax to the town on that, because they, is 3% of what? 3% of what they say they took in, or 3% of what they actually took in? So again, being a cash-only business, that's another byproduct of having a cash-only business, is the cash-only business.
Yeah, are either one of you aware of how that is addressed in other places, or?
I'm not aware how it's addressed in states that already have legalized marijuana.
The cash
I'm
aspect.
not sure.
Yeah, I'll have to do some additional
That's a good
research
question.
and find the answer to that. And what about, there's some other issues that people have. One is just, it's going to be legal in the state. Residents are going to be able to get it. Why make them have to drive? If all the towns surrounding us are also going to, disallow it, why make them have to drive into Boston
I'll
or
just follow up on that.
Salem or something?
So if the reverse of that is, if Burlington had it, that means all those other people would be coming here,
Right.
as opposed to, like Barbara said, people can still use it, grow it, cultivate it. This is retail stores, pot shops. It is what it is.
And also marijuana cafes.
And yeah, edibles.
Yes.
I mean, you mentioned on it earlier about children mistaking an edible. I mean, we have children eating detergent pods because they look like edibles. We start bringing these into the town, there's potential for a tragedy.
Yes. So the fear of a young child coming across it and not knowing what it is.
Right.
And I guess the other thing that that I've seen raised is that one issue is that for some patients it's difficult to get the medical clearance, or there's no these dispensaries, the recreational come faster, maybe be cheaper for people. So it's like a way for people who need this for medical reasons, but the hassle or the hurdles to get the medical sort of clearance are too high. This would be a nice way for them to go about doing that.
The hurdles to get the medical referral for marijuana, actually, it's not time consuming. It's expensive though. So I do think that for patients that need medical marijuana, now that it is available for recreational use, it will make it less expensive because they won't have to pay that initial upfront cost that they would have to pay to get the referral from a doctor. I also think this will make it easier for medical marijuana patients to obtain their product because it's going to be more readily available than it is currently. Right now, to my knowledge, the only medical marijuana facilities that are open are in Salem, Boston, and I think maybe one in Framingham, but I'm not sure it's even opened yet. So I do think that this will actually help those patients because it will be more readily available. Might not be in Burlington, but it probably won't be as far away as it is right now for medical marijuana.
And to follow up on that, basically medical marijuana was given to prescriptions given to someone who has a medical condition.
Right.
If they're bypassing a doctor or a medical professional and seeking their own medication or their own prescription or getting their own pot, basically, they're bypassing that. They're medicating themselves without the guidance of a medical professional. So yeah, it might be easier for them, but it's like, it would be like buying medication without going to your doctor first. This is for a medical reason. That's what we're told. So
People do that
why get the medication
aspirin and everything all the
without
They do.
seeing a doctor?
Yes. So it may be, I hadn't thought of that, Jim. It's a good point because I suppose there may be a question as to what the correct quantity is or something like that. I hadn't even thought of that.
Yeah, I wonder how detailed they get into it with that.
Well,
I don't know.
medication comes in different strengths
Sure.
and dosages. You're basically letting the person decide, not the doctor, and that could be, bad.
That having been said, I think it's going to happen because I think that the amount of, although it's not a great effort, there is some effort required to get a medical marijuana referral, and there is some cost to it. If you didn't have to go through that step and you needed this for some medical reason, why would you put yourself through that? I think you would just go to a recreational shop.
Right, most likely. I think that will be what most people end up doing.
Yeah.
Because it seemed like the medical was a stepping stone to get to a recreational, at least in some regards, or for some people.
Yes, and I think I know we talked about this at the beginning of the segment, but I want to stress this again, that this does not prohibit people from getting medical marijuana or using marijuana for medical reasons or any other reasons. This is strictly regarding the retail sale. We are not trying to restrict people's rights that they have now under this law in Massachusetts.
Right. So it's just you don't want it to be sold here in town.
Right.
I guess that makes sense. And the last thing, and this has been brought up a couple of times at your meetings, is this idea or argument that keeping it, not allowing these shops open up, it keeps it just means that people will probably go to themselves to get it, or they'll just keep selling it, on the black market illegally. Could be
Right.
more dangerous, not regulated. What's the argument against that?
Well, there's still going to be recreational marijuana shops available within a reasonable distance. So I do think that people will be going to these shops to buy it legally rather than buying it on the black market, unless they're underage and they have to buy it on the black market anyway, because people who are underage can't go into a regular shop and buy it, just like they can't buy alcohol or cigarettes.
Right. Okay.
People were getting it when it was illegal. They had no problem getting it then. I'm sure they'll have no problem getting it now that it's legal.
But perhaps and hopefully a good percentage of those people will go to regular licensed recreational marijuana shops so that they know that they're getting a certain quality of product, that there's nothing mixed into it.
I think that is a concern,
Right.
the safety aspect of,
Right.
knowing at least this place is regulated as opposed
Yes.
to the guy down the street who
Exactly.
you don't know what he's doing with it.
That's right, and I think that is a valid concern. And I do think, and I hope, that people who are going to be purchasing it will go to licensed recreational marijuana dealers to get their product for their own safety.
Right. All right, very good. I think that kind of hits all the major topics that I was
Okay.
looking at. Any other sort of points that you think people need to know?
No, like I said, that vote in November was an eye-opener. Burlington residents spoke clearly and loudly that they didn't want recreational retail marijuana in their town. And we're doing it on behalf of the residents. That's why the committee was formed, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
All right.
Okay.
Very good. Barbara LaRue of the Planning Board, Jimmy Tickets of the Board of Selectmen, thank you very much for coming on BNEWS In Depth.
Thank you for
Thank you,
having
Richard.
us. Thank you.
And welcome back. We go now to the discussion with two people who have spoken against the ban to hear their thoughts. Let's check it out. And welcome back to BNEWS In Depth. I'm now joined by two people who are on the opposite side of the issue. We would not like to see the marijuana recreational sale ban go into effect. They are Burlington resident Kelly Lax and Burlington resident and Town Meeting and Land Use Committee member Monty Pearson. Thanks for joining me.
Glad to be here.
So let's just start off in general. When you saw at the meet, we came to know you because you've spoken at a couple of planning board meetings now. You did the same thing, but we knew you beforehand. Just sort of talk about, what was your initial reaction when you heard of the proposal to have the two bylaw articles before town meeting that would prohibit the sale of recreational marijuana?
Well, I was struck by the way in which people were not really using evidence to make a public policy decision for the town. And I really think that we shouldn't be making this decision based on people's fears and what their concerns are, vague things or hearsay, and really ought to be looking at some of the facts. And so, I think some of the things that we're going to talk about are going to be what the studies have shown, which actually present a whole different picture about how to look at this marijuana situation.
Yeah, when I arrived, I actually came to the planning board meeting for an unrelated issue, and I happened to notice it on the docket, so we stuck around and just started listening to other people speak. And I was struck by several members who brought up points that I hadn't even considered, things such as, medical marijuana being a difficult thing to obtain for some people and having recreational making it easier. Things that I'd never considered as someone who has no need of medical marijuana. But the arguments opposing it, as he mentioned, were just more emotional based. They were very much related to people's fears and to their concerns that had no factual evidence. They were, oh, well, I heard of something over here, or what if this happens? There was a lot of what ifs that aren't backed up by what we know based on places that have done this already, Colorado, Wyoming. And so really my goal was to just speak and just get it on the record that we should look into facts. That was really the only purpose I had when I spoke, was just, let's talk about the facts of this instead of the fear.
Now I see you both brought some reading materials. So we'll address some of the fears that people brought up later. But to start, what do you think are some of the, the benefits to the town or to the residents of, having this be allowed? Maybe starting with tax revenue, which seems to be the big one. Any strong argument that this will be a boon to Burlington?
Well, sure. I mean, so if you look at 2015, the total revenue for the state of Colorado was like $135 million. Now, obviously, Burlington is not the size of the state of Colorado,
True.
So we wouldn't be able to say, oh yes, we're going to be $135 million richer in our bank account. That's not how that works. But if you break it down even to a relative proportion, you're still talking about tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars that Burlington could realize just by imposing that, extra tax that the cities are allowed to based on the law that Massachusetts put into place. And that money would be incredibly helpful. I mean, speaking from a purely selfish standpoint, we have Burlington recreational events. It'd be great if we could expand some of those, and those are things, obviously they're extras, but then there's things like sidewalks or educational seminars for kids. I mean, there are just hundreds of ways that you could really use extra money to make the town a better place. And as someone who's a new resident here, that's something that's really interesting to me and was one of the reasons I chose Burlington in the first place. I thought it was good, and I want to keep improving it because I think that's how life should work. You should always be striving to improve your life.
I think that my biggest, the thing I think is really the most in favor of not having these bans go through is dealing with the opioid crisis. And that comes in two dimensions. The first is that if you think about people in Burlington who are using marijuana, then right now they get it on the black market, and they get it through dealers, and those dealers have access to drugs other than marijuana. And so anytime a young person, a 26-year-old or a 16-year-old, is going and working with a dealer and giving them money for marijuana, they're also interacting with a person who would be happy to sell them opioids or cocaine or other kinds of much more nasty drugs than marijuana. So by having a recreational marijuana store in Burlington, we would be wiping out that black market and taking away that risk that kids and young adults and other users are interacting with people who are going to try to sell them opioids. There's another thing about the opioid thing, which is that about half of the people who die from overdoses of opioids are already on legal painkillers that were prescribed for them by doctors. And the other half are, most of them got started using a prescription drug of one sort or another. Usually a prescription drug, that had some kind of opioid in it. And what studies have found is that in the 13 states with medical marijuana laws, doctors tend not to give as many opioid prescriptions to patients because the doctors know that the patients can use marijuana, medical marijuana, instead to treat that pain. And so, and the study found that in those 13 states, each doctor gave 1,826 fewer doses, prescription doses of opioids to patients each year because they knew that they could tell their patient to either go and get medical marijuana or get recreational marijuana. And so I think that having a store here where people who are having arthritis pain, when I went back to Washington this summer to visit friends, I knew a couple of my friends who had a lot of arthritis pains. They're people in their 60s, and they found that they were able to sleep much better at night by having a little bit of marijuana. Mm-hmm. Now, it seems to me that that if people want to do that, I think that they ought to be able to do that. They're not harming anybody doing that. And that's what a marijuana store would bring to us. So you take out the drug dealers and you have people go to a regulated state store, and there are lots of improvements that you've made in the number of people who are using opioids and getting into trouble using opioids. So that's, to me, is a a major reason for us to really seriously consider not doing this ban on stores.
And I think one of the things, to your first point there, that the people in favor of the ban would bring up is that, 16-year-olds, for example, even if, the store is loud, they aren't going to have access to it. They'll still be getting, their marijuana if they choose to do so on the black market. Do you think there's any way that, even though it's, not going to be available to them, that it still makes a safer environment overall?
Well, actually, I think that the comparison between marijuana and alcohol is a really good one, because they're both drugs, if you consider the technical term of it, and they both, give you an altered state of mind. And we've seen, obviously kids drink underage. That happens. 16-year-olds, it happens. There's no getting around that. But you'll notice that they're not going to, say, gang lords to get their alcohol, or they're not doing it. There's no black market for alcohol because it's so well regulated. Now, granted, they're still getting it. There's no denying that. But they're getting it from, friends or parents in some cases, depending.
Brothers and sisters.
Yep. And that's, I think, a really great comparison for people who would be concerned about that, because, well, if it's your kid, and remember, you can only control your kid. Unfortunately, you can't control the rest of the kids. That's just how it works. You can control, okay, are their brothers and sisters giving it to them? I'm not going to. Brothers and sisters aren't going to. If you make sure your kids have good friends that don't give them to them, they're not going to be getting it from that source. And if you remove, like he was saying, the illegal part of it, where you have people who know how to get it illegally, if all the only sources are available are legal ones, then you have a much better chance of regulating that, as opposed to when it's illegal, then everyone, it's always, under the covers in a back alley. I mean, it's a stereotype, but it's true for a reason, When you don't have a legal way of regulating something, it's a lot easier to get your hands on it in the wrong way.
Now, one of the concerns, raised, we can start kind of going over what the other side brings up, is safety of things, people coming into Burlington, because we know Burlington's a destination for, a lot of things. We got the mall, people come to Burlington to buy things, and we already have a lot of traffic, and if people are coming to Burlington to get a drug that would alter them, won't that, therefore have the potential of making our streets more dangerous as far as, drivers under the influence?
I think that concern is just way overstated, because when people go to marijuana stores to buy things, they don't consume it in the stores. They purchase it and they get in their car, and then they go back to work, or they go back to shopping, and then they go home and then they consume it. I was in Washington and Colorado this summer because I was visiting friends. I grew up in Washington State. And the stores are little tiny places, because if you think about it, a marijuana store doesn't have a huge variety of products, right? It's not a department store. It's not a Macy's. So all of the stores that I saw in both states were little tiny stores, and they had no outside advertising because of the regulations. And people went in, they purchased what they wanted, and they left, and they got in their car and they drove away. They didn't hang out on the sidewalk and smoke dope and talk to other people or things like that. I mean, these are not marijuana cafes that we're talking about. We're talking about grocery stores. And when you go to the grocery store, you don't walk out of the store and immediately grip into the bag and start eating things, right? The marijuana store is the same kind of thing. So the idea that people are going to get high while they're at the store and then drive around like crazy in Burlington is just, that's just not going to happen.
And also, for example, when I used to be in college, we would drive up to New Hampshire to get alcohol because the stores up there would have sales and whatnot.
Sure.
You can't drink and drive. You can't smoke and drive. At no point did I ever consider when I went up to the store in New Hampshire, oh, I should just crack open a bottle of wine right now and drink it on the way home. It's not legal, so of course you're not going to do that. And people, by and large, are law-abiding citizens. That's how that works, statistically.
Yeah. So the people who are gonna do it are gonna do it, but for the most part,
Exactly.
it won't be that. Though I have to say, full disclosure, I have left the grocery store and immediately started eating at least something on the way home.
And what kind of substance was that?
Well, probably chips.
Sugar. Oh, no.
More salt.
Sugar, salt.
I was wondering if, so last November when this was voted on at the state level, one of the arguments is that Burlington had a great turnout as far as that election. It was, obviously the contested presidential election, and the vote was 54 against, 44 so in favor, with a couple, blanks. So the committee that was formed pretty much relied on that, saying that Burlington's already spoken. Any thoughts on that? And also, to sort of pair on that, we have the town meeting votes, but there was also talk of a ballot initiative, to putting it back to the voters. Do you think that would be something, let people sort of re-vote, re-decide the issue?
So they actually, they looked up the numbers, and I did just a basic little bit of math, and so what ends up being is 54 to 44, like you said. If a little bit less than 600 people change their mind, now we have a different majority. And that's always sort of the hard part when you have a majority. Yes, it's definitely a majority, but it's not a decisive, 90% of people all believe in one thing. We're talking about something less than like 2% of the population of Burlington changing their minds in the space of a year. And if you look at the trends of what people believe about marijuana as more facts come out and as people become more educated about the subject and as there's more studies done as well, which is really important about the effects of marijuana and what is realistic and happening as opposed to the fear of what could happen, you start to realize that people's perceptions of marijuana have changed drastically in the last 10 years. For example, we have things like a ballot initiative asking for the legalization of marijuana, where 10 years ago that would have been unthinkable.
Right. I mean, people were sort of surprised, I think, when medical passed the first time.
Exactly. So given that that has changed so rapidly, I don't know that I find it unreasonable to think that 600 people could have changed their mind in the course of a year. That doesn't strike me as unreasonable. Now, I understand where the committee is coming from and saying, all right, this is what we were given. But I don't know that, given the margin, it makes sense to automatically jump to, we should just ban it in the city. Because if we don't pass these bylaws, it doesn't mean that suddenly marijuana shops pop up everywhere. All it means is that there's the potential to do so, and they still have to be vetted. They still have to go through all of the regular processes the planning board has in terms of answering questions and justifying their existence. We're just leaving that possibility open. And that, I think, was the other thing that bothered me about this, was just we had a marginal victory, and they decided to take that and run with it as saying, from here on out, this shall never happen. And I just thought that that seemed, I don't know, just very narrow-minded.
And
I was very disappointed that the planning board responded to this situation in the way it did, because the planning board and the Board of Selectmen handled the medical marijuana situation in a much different way, in a way that I thought was really appropriate. They went out and they made a set of bylaws that said, yes, you can have a store, but you need to there are regulations about where it's going to be and who and how you could advertise and things like that. And they put that into the bylaws so that everybody's concerns got addressed. And I just think it's inappropriate response for us to say no. I mean, it's really insulting to the 6,253 people who voted in favor of the referendum, and they're 45% of the people who live here in town, to say, well, you lost, and so we're not going to have it at all. it doesn't seem to me to be the appropriate policy response. And the appropriate policy response is to say, well, we're going to have medical marijuana, but we're going to have recreational marijuana, but we have some concerns about it, so we're going to handle it in a way where we regulate it a way that calms some people's fears. And the approach that the Planning Board and the Board of Selectmen have done in this way is a prohibition that just doesn't make any sense to me.
Now, as a member of town meeting, do you think that town meeting is the proper place to have this vote happen, or should it be something that goes back to the ballot for all voters? Or
I'm a big supporter of town meeting. I think that town meeting is extremely democratic. There are 120 members, 120 of the most involved people in town who keep up on what's going on in town, and they're elected by their neighbors. And I just think New England Town Meeting is a model for the rest of the world. So you don't get me started on town meeting. It's
definitely democracy in action.
It's definitely democracy in action, and so I think it's a great place for this to be discussed. And I don't know that having a town referendum is necessarily the best way to do this. Keep in mind that, like last time we had it, we have only 10% of the population voting during
that's the concern.
During town elections, and so that's not exactly a representative sample of people. Yeah. And so I think that town meeting is a good place for this to be discussed. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion.
The last thing that I had was at least one of the speakers at one of the recent planning board meetings sort of brought up his concern that, Burlington, growing business community, growing, sort of new restaurants, all this sort of like, high-end technology entrepreneurs coming in, that having a recreational marijuana shops throughout town would sort of change the atmosphere or the perception of Burlington. Any response to that? You spoke about it at quite some length, so.
So I find that the idea that the perception of other people, one, should govern what you do is something that we teach our kindergartners to ignore. Don't judge people by what they look like or by what they, dress like. You're supposed to be judging them by what their actions show you. And something that someone does recreationally that is now legal, that doesn't harm anyone else, is not a valid reason to judge someone. It's the same way that you wouldn't judge someone who goes and has a drink after work. Well, I mean, obviously there are people out there who do judge those people, but by and large, the reasonable thing is, that's a socially acceptable thing. And marijuana has a stigma to it that is based and driven by programs like DARE, which my husband actually was a graduate, so was I.
Me too.
And yep. And some of what they taught was excellent. The idea of exposing kids who might not otherwise know about the harmful side effects of drugs were great. But the idea that, and this was a lot of what we were taught, which was just, if you smoke marijuana, you will become addicted and then you will die. And that was the by and large, that was the message. Doing drugs is bad, there are no exceptions, end of story. And we have research that shows that that's not true. Marijuana isn't addictive. It does alter your state, but no more than alcohol does. And taken by a reasonable, responsible adult, which is the predicate of this, there isn't a problem. And so the idea that we would alter the town's bylaws because we're worried of what other people will think of us is an interesting concept to me, and one that I don't think is actually backed up either by economic statistics. Colorado's economics have not gone down. They've increased their revenue by a sizable margin. People aren't suddenly, now granted, they are making fun of Colorado. There's no getting around the fact that there are jokes about Colorado people and weed. But they're not doing that to Washington, which I find is a little bit interesting. It's mostly Colorado. And the other part of that is, so what? If people are sitting there and occasionally a joke comes up, I don't think that that's really something that we should enact laws about. That doesn't seem to be a reasonable adult thing to do.
I think that there's this kind of sense that for Burlington to be a family-oriented community, we couldn't have a marijuana store. And it's a little odd because I think that alcohol is actually a much more dangerous drug. And as a town meeting member, I have always voted against adding more liquor licenses in town because I think that we're overdoing it. I think that, in Colorado and in Washington, studies have found that teenage use of marijuana did not go up when they made recreational marijuana legal. And I think that there's no reason to think that Burlington, as a family-oriented town, is going to lose that reputation because there's a marijuana store where people can drive up and buy marijuana and go home and use it. Is going to be a problem. Burlington has dozens and dozens of retail stores and people drinking alcohol everywhere, and that hasn't affected our reputation, although maybe it's gotten it higher in terms of tech people. I don't know, but I don't think
it's one of the amenities that draws people in.
Yes, people talk about having places to go out and drink as an amenity. So, I mean, I just don't think that a marijuana store is going to have that much of an effect on what the town is like. It certainly won't affect the kids who are on TV or anything who are on TV. The kids who are teenagers, those who don't smoke are not going to smoke, and those who do smoke are going to smoke. And it's not going to be affected by whether or not there's a store here.
All right.
There was one other thing too.
Sure.
People are constantly, in the country, it's us versus them. And that's something I noticed as part of the discussion and the debate that we had at the planning board meetings was, well, what happens when we let pot smokers into the town? Like, what happens to our values? But what people don't understand is 1 in 2 people have smoked pot. So when you're talking about us versus them, it's your neighbors, it's your friends, it's your coworkers. Someone you know has smoked pot, and they're still the same person. And that's the big thing is, if we get rid of that stigma of, oh, it's other people doing this thing, that I think will be a very important distinction. And that is something, that's one of the reasons I wanted to speak out, because if we start seeing other people they just do something that you don't, that's it. That's the only difference. And that shouldn't alter your perception of them.
All right. Well, we are out of time. I want to thank you both for coming in. It was an interesting discussion. Monty Beerthen, Kelly Lax, appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So there you have it, 2 different perspectives on the issue of banning recreational marijuana sales in town. As said, town meeting will vote on the bylaw changes during its session that begins on Monday, September 25th. Did either argument seen here persuade you? You can reach out to your town meeting members and share your thoughts with them. If you don't know them, the full list of town meeting members by precinct can be found on the town website, complete with contact information. I'd like to thank you for watching our premiere episode of BNEWS In Depth. I'm BNEWS Director Rich Hosford, and we'll see you next time.